This is the IDP After Show.
Hello and a very welcome back to the IDP After Show. If you've been tuning into the weekly IDP preview shows in season, then you'll recognize me as your host, Jase Abbey. And as the fantasy season is over with now, and as the preview shows have come to an end, we're going to continue to be bringing you lots of off-season content between the main IDP show hosted by Josh, Addy and Bob and the IDP show over here. We'll have a weekly show all the way through to the start of the 2025 season. Now, I'm going to kick off the inaugural IDP After Show off-season episodes by looking at the 2024 ADP in review. We're going to be looking at some of the players who are huge hits and complaining about some of the players who were huge misses. We'll be using data from the 36 IDP best ball drafts that we held before the season started and comparing that to how those players performed using Big Three scoring. And just to be clear, these were real drafts in leagues where money was on the line in many cases, so we know the data actually means something. So regular viewers of the IDP After Show will know that I was joined every single week for the entire season by some of the best IDP minds in the IDP space, and we're going to continue that theme throughout the off-season. So helping me cover the ADP hits and misses from 2024 today is someone who I've been pretty excited to welcome on. Please put it together for IDP writer at the IDP Show, Mr. Eric Harms. Eric, how's it going?
Oh, it's fantastic. Thanks for having me on, Jase. It's a pleasure, and I've been looking forward to this too, and your show has been great all year, so I'm happy to be on.
Too kind. My pleasure. My pleasure. Now, as I say, I've been looking forward to this one for a while. I'm kind of made up that I get to do it with you because I know you were heavily involved in a lot of those best ball drafts, so you've definitely got your finger on the pulse when it comes to this stuff, right?
Yeah, I don't remember how many I was in, but it was I don't know, maybe 20 or so. There was quite a few of those that I was in. So, I did a lot of drafting this last off season, and I plan on doing it again this year so I can keep my finger on that pulse, as you said.
It's a great way to prepare for the season, I think, and for obviously drafts for in other fantasy leagues, I think. So, I'll be right there with you, I'm sure. So, look, we've got a whole bunch of players to talk about tonight, 20 in total. We've come up with a unique list of one IDP overperformer compared to ADP and one underperformer at each of the 5 defensive positions. So linebacker, edge, DT, safety, and cornerback. We're going to talk, for our audience's sake, we're going to talk about what their ADP was, where they finished in Big Three scoring, and we'll talk a little bit about each of our nominations as well, a bit of background stuff too. So we'll do them in the order I just mentioned, overperformers, then underperformers at linebacker, edge, DT, and so on. And we'll alternate between our nominations as we go. Eric, as my guest, it's your right to go first. So please tell us who your ADP hit or overperformer, if you will, was at the linebacker spot.
All right, Jase. For the linebacker spot, I chose Kaden Elliss of the Atlanta Falcons. His ADP was linebacker 36 and overall 90.8. But he finished the season scoring, again, that's Big Three scoring at linebacker 3. So that's a great jump. Going into the season in the drafts, a lot of people worried about Nate Landman taking some snaps. Troy Anderson coming back from injury. So there was, I think his ADP was suppressed just a touch by those concerns. So he ended up providing great value. He had 150 tackles on the year, which is just great. 5 sacks, a forced fumble, a fumble return, an interception. So he gave you a little bit of everything. And he had solid production pretty much every week too. Never below 8.5 points in any given week. And then he had some boom weeks too and got up as high as 30 points in 1 week. So I had 9 games with double-digit tackles. So just solid pretty much every week. Was great in the playoffs. I know several people picked him as their player of the year including you. So that's who I went with for the overperformer.
Yeah, I was one of those people. And I kind of did it just to, I knew Baun was going to be a popular choice and I wanted to choose someone a bit different. But as you say, I did it because, he gave us that solid weekly floor, high tackle volume. Also produced a lot of big plays. As we got into the sort of fantasy playoff weeks as well. He got a sack in 4 straight games. So yeah, lots to like about what we saw from him in 2024. Good choice. So Zack Baun was my choice in this spot, and after, as I say, going in a different direction with my IDP MVP, I kind of felt like I had to mention Baun here. Considering how important linebacker is in fantasy, and I know we're not nominating an overall ADP MVP hit, but Baun would probably be my choice if we were. ADP LB 81, 234th defensive player taken off the board, and yet he finished as the LB 2. To my mind, it doesn't really get much better than that, I don't think. Now, I've got to put my hands up, though, Eric, and admit that, I did this on one of the preview shows as well. I must admit that before the season started, even when all that hype was circulating around Baun, I wasn't a massive believer. But, he proved me wrong, as he did with many others, looking at where he was being drafted, and finished with like 155 tackles, 4 sacks, 5 forced fumbles, 2 interceptions, 3 pass breakups. It was just incredible. Difference maker right there, and obviously one of those guys that was on a lot of championship winning fantasy rosters, I think.
Yeah, and I was right there with you. I think a lot of people were with you on not believing in Baun preseason. He started getting the hype. Fangio was talking him up, and nobody thought he would really play over Devin White, even though none of us like Devin White's play that much. He's not really been a good player in the NFL. Especially PFF grades and all that. But I think you weren't alone on that. And we switched places here because Zack Baun was my IDP and MVP on the year. So we just kind of switched places on this one.
I like it. So let's talk about the misses at linebacker. Who was an ADP letdown, or a letdown compared to their ADP for you?
I had trouble with this one a little bit. There were some choices, and I was trying not to ding people too much for missing a lot of time. Kind of wanted to pick Alshire. He created some of that himself with the suspension and that nasty hit. But I went with Roquan Smith, and he was ADP linebacker 2, and overall 10.4. So he's drafted in the first round, into the first round, and he finishes linebacker 19, which isn't a huge disappointment, but if you're drafting him in the first round and he's linebacker 2, it is a disappointment, and you want more out of that player. So that's why I picked him. You just want more out of your stars. This is the second straight season of dipping fantasy production. He had 290 points in 22, down to 239 last year, and then this year he had 210. He did miss a game, but he's just been dipping a little bit, and he's still solid year. 154 tackles, a sack and a half. Had some big plays with a forced fumble, a fumble recovery, interception. But he's just kind of going the wrong way the last couple of years, and I wanted to highlight that. He's still only 27 years old, so I think there's still lots of potential and lots of star power in him to turn this around, this recent trend, and I'm hopeful for that for next year, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, as you say, it wasn't a horrible year for him, but if I'd have said that Roquan was going to be in that lower order of LB2s this year, people wouldn't have believed me, right? So, pretty solid across the board, but tackle numbers were slightly down, big plays are slightly down, and that's enough to separate the men from the boys, I think. So, it's a shame when we're talking about a guy drafted that highly. But yeah, ADP of 2 and an LB 19 finish just doesn't really cut it to my mind. And I've gone in a similar direction with my pick here as well. So my guy was equally as disappointing, perhaps even more so, considering the numbers. But I've gone with Foyesade Oluokun here, and he was the LB1 in ADP. The 18th defender taken overall, and yet he finished as the LB 37. Now, I did consider and did factor in that he missed time, missed 4 games. I decided that was going to be my cutoff. It was going to be 3, as I mentioned to you pre-show, but I upped it to 4 just so I can mention Oluokun. But even so, it wasn't a good year, even though we factor in those missed games. I mean, in 2023, he had only 2 games where he failed to finish with double-digit points in Big 3 scoring. And he had some huge weeks that year as well, 27 points, 37, 33. And that's kind of weak winning output, isn't it? But this year finished with fewer than 10 points in 5 of his 13 games. And his biggest game came in week 1 when he had just shy of 23 points. We know those extra sort of snaps that he played on the edge didn't really help. And I know he played a bit more in the slot as well, bizarrely, and that didn't really help either. I wanted to give him a pass for those reasons, but in the end, I just couldn't. ADP 1, way too high considering where he finished.
And he wasn't playing 100% of the snaps most weeks either, especially early in the season. He wasn't getting the snap share he's used to getting, and just an overall disappointment this year for Foye. I kind of wonder how that's going to look going forward. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, not a good year for the top two linebackers on reflection. So let's talk edge. Who is your ADP edge hit of the year at the edge spot?
Okay, I took Denver Bronco Nik Bonitto. And
Nice.
He was edge 55, defensive line 74, and overall 139. But he finished as edge number 4, which is a huge jump for him. Great year. I was a little worried going into the year. There was Browning and Bonitto and Cooper, and they brought in John Franklin Myers. Who's going to get what snaps? What's the snap share going to look like here? So I was fading him during the drafts and not usually getting him. I was waiting a little too long. I know Adam was big on drafting all those guys, and I think it was just one of them's going to perform for sure, and possibly 2. So really, Browning started off the first week having double the snaps of Bonitto. Then he got hurt in week 2 and was put on IR and missed several weeks. And when he came back, they were about even. Bonitto was actually a little bit ahead on snap count, and then they traded him to Arizona. So Bonitto just had a great year. From that point on, he just kind of took over and was great. He had 48 tackles, 13.5 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, a fumble recovery, an interception. He had 5 weeks over 20 points, which is great, and only 4 under 10 points. So when you have an edge, a lot of times you worry about those highs and lows, especially the lows. Here's what you're worried about: how many 2, 3, 4 point weeks you're going to have. Well, he mostly avoided those. So just a great week for him, or a great year for him. He was 55 to 70% of snaps most weeks for the rest of the year there. So really enjoyed him this year.
Yeah, I really like this pick because, and the point that you made there was the one I was going to mention, the consistency really. Like you say, we expect up and down weeks at the edge spot. If they don't get a sack, sometimes these guys score very few points, and we can't rely on them to get a sack every game, but 12 of 18 games for Bonitto. I know he kind of faded a little bit in the playoffs, but as the guys said on the IDP MVP show, he got most of those fantasy managers to that point anyway, so we can't complain too much, right?
Right.
Yeah. So my choice at edge, and it will probably surprise nobody to hear his name being brought up on this show. It's Andrew Van Ginkel. He was the edge 36 taken in those best ball drafts, the 87th defender off the board overall, and he made our modest expectations, I would say, look silly by the end of the season. Finishes the edge 1 overall. We know we started the year well. And that early season success meant his kind of snap count, or his snap share, if you like, became bigger as the season wore on. Pat Jones kind of faded away. Dallas Turner never really ate into Van Ginkel's role in the way that we maybe became concerned about pre-season. And ultimately, there were only 4 games where Van Ginkel failed to put up double-digit points. So, again, when we're talking about consistency, in the case of Bonitto, in the case of your pick, that kind of applies to AVG as well. Like I say, I think some are probably a little bit scared of Dallas Turner, but I think this is one where maybe we should have seen this coming. AVG was actually really good last year, didn't get to double-digit sacks, but he was a really good player last year, and maybe we kind of got a bit of that rookie fever and expected him to give way a little earlier than clearly he had plans to do.
Yeah, and he followed Flores over from Miami to Minnesota, so we probably should have seen more of that coming. With Flores likes AVG, he's going to play him. And so I think that should have been maybe a little bit bigger clue to us that he'd hold off Dallas Turner a little bit longer and all season long. And he was just such a joy to watch this year. Just big play after big play, and the long flowing locks. And anyway, really enjoyed watching him this year, and a great season for AVG. I actually put a bet on him to be MVP or the Defensive Player of the Year about halfway through the season, and I don't think that's going to work out, but it was a long shot, good odds, so I tried.
Well, like you say, good. I'd imagine they were good odds, but that was an inspired choice at the midway point. Fingers crossed for you. Let's talk these misses then. Who let us down at the edge spot compared to where we were drafting them before the season started?
I chose Matt Judon. He was edge 16, DL 17, which looking back, I know he was getting drafted in the second and third round quite a bit, but that still kind of surprised me he was that high. Overall, he was 26.6. He finished as edge 39, 41 tackles, 5.5 sacks, 1 interception. With the Patriots, before he got hurt last year, he was getting 80, 90% of snaps most games. With the Falcons, so you think, oh, he's going to the Falcons. They're needy at edge. He's going to play 80, 90% of snaps at least. And he didn't. He played 50, 60% of snaps most games, which is just really disappointing and not what people expected. And I think that's the biggest reason for his dip and disappointment. But he had 7 games below 5 points. And that's rough. Only had 3 above 15 points. So he didn't really even give you the booms, not very often. So just a really disappointing, frustrating year if you drafted Matt Judon.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he started okay the first couple of games. He ended okay, I think. But there was that huge stretch in the middle of the season where he did so little. I was looking at the PFF numbers the other day, and there was like a huge spell where he didn't have more than 1 pressure, let alone sacks, but just 1 pressure in a single game. So yeah, massively disappointing. The pressure rate was way down, well under 10%. I forget the exact figure, but yeah, this is a good shout. And I'm glad to say I wasn't on the Judon train this year.
I was.
So I feel bad now.
No, you're fine.
So for my choice, Eric, I thought about this one for a while. There was a few contenders at this spot. I could have gone in, I feel like any number of directions really, but in the end I settled on Montez Sweat. He was the edge 11 in ADP and the 18th defender taken overall. So expectations were high, right? We expected him to finish as a low end edge 1, but I think maybe 2023 was the reason for that and for those heightened expectations. 16 sacks is a really good number. I don't blame people for thinking that way. But his production just completely nosedived this year. Only 6 sacks, played in all but 1 game as well. And that's what really hurts, I think. If we've got somebody who's performing at a high level, but he's injured, at least we can kind of pivot away to another player and hope that replacement performs. But when we've drafted someone like Sweat with the 11th, or as the 11th edge taken off the board, you're kind of stuck with him. And that's just super disappointing for me. Edge 46, taken as the edge 11, that's a huge disparity, I think, versus the end of season finish. And ultimately, he left me. I had him in a couple of leagues, and a lot of other IDP managers really unhappy.
Yeah, for sure. I actually was not drafting him very often. He was going a little bit higher than I would have wanted to take him in most drafts. But I would have taken him shortly thereafter. So it wasn't like I knew something that nobody else did. I would have taken him shortly after he got taken. It seemed like he had a real good end of last year too, to me. Yeah. Seemed like he was fitting in Chicago and he was the guy, and it just fell apart this year.
Yeah. Going to be avoiding him like the plague next year, personally. But the damage is already done for those teams where I did draft him.
Yes, sometimes you need that other guy on the other side, just to take some of the pressure off you and avoid getting double teamed. And I have no idea how many times he got double teamed this year, but he's their game plan on Chicago's defensive line. He's the one they're worried about. And so sometimes maybe they draft somebody this year that'll help them out, or get somebody in free agency that maybe will help them out. We'll have to watch that.
Yeah, he will. I've got a feeling they're going to go with the offensive line, but
and they should.
Yeah.
They got holes.
But hey, but yes, you're right. They haven't really got a lot there to take some of that attention away from Sweat. So, but yeah, we kind of knew that going into the season. So should we have been drafting him as the 11th edge? I guess is the real question there. I'm not sure we should. But hey, we're sweating Sweat too much. Let's talk DTs. That was a great segue, wasn't it?
It was amazing.
So let's talk about the DTs, the big boys. They often get forgotten in fantasy, certainly in those 3 position leagues. But you're going to mention a name I know who was a stud, irrespective of whether people have 3 or 5 position leagues. Who you got here?
I've got Zack Allen. People are going to think I'm a Bronco fan, and I'm not. But just a great year for him. He was drafted as DT 18. Overall defensive lineman is 63, and then overall ADP of 123. And he finished as DT 2 behind the guy that you're going to mention here in a bit. 61 tackles, which is great for a defensive tackle. 8.5 sacks. He had 75 pressures, which to me is just astounding. In addition to 8.5 stacks, he had 28 QB hits. So how many more times, is he real close to getting another sack? Also, like the other Bronco I mentioned, 5 weeks over 20 points and only 4 under 10. Exactly the same. Not that they had the same points, but very few low weeks. His snap counts were in the 80s and 90s all year long. So when sometimes the best ability is the availability and being on the field and getting those high snap counts on a defensive tackle, which you often don't get. If you get 50-60% from a defensive tackle, you're usually in a pretty good range. And Zack Allen was out on the field all the time, racking up stats, and it was a great year for him. And a great year for you if you drafted him.
Yes, but not so great a year if in your dynasty leagues you managed to trade away Zack Allen in years prior, as I tended to do. But yeah, I've heard him, or I saw a tweet actually. Someone was giving him a little bit of flack because he'd played so many snaps compared to the other DT. I think he was the only one who played over 1,000 snaps. But you've still got to perform, right? You're going to be on the field a lot. You've still got to actually produce, and he did, and then some. And I bet those same detractors are the same people talking about how well Adam Butler did, despite the fact that he was like 4th or 5th in total snaps, and barely put up half the pressures that Zack Allen did, and certainly less than half the sacks. So yeah, this is a good shout here, Eric. You don't need me to tell you that. I really like it. My choice was a no-brainer, really. And he had some selections or nominations in the IDP MVP episode that I've referred to earlier, and for good reason. Leonard Williams, by the way, was 19th DT taken overall, the 135th defender, and yet he finished as the DT1. Now, he had some quiet weeks. We expect that at the DT spot, maybe more so than at any other spot, I think. But what helped Williams become the DT1 was some huge weeks, massive weeks. Week 13, he had 59 points, coming up with, that was the 2-sack, interception, touchdown, 4-tackle game that everyone remembers. He also had weeks with 41 points, 34, 23, 23 again, and the list just goes on. I think, again, if we're looking for difference makers in terms of relative value compared to other DTs, then it's really hard to look beyond the likes of Williams in this spot, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And had he not gotten hurt, I probably would have been talking about his old teammate, Dexter Lawrence, in this segment until he got hurt. But Leonard Williams was just amazing this year. And nobody saw that coming. You're, like you said, you're getting him really late in drafts and hoping for some breakout games, and you got him week after week after week.
Yeah. Just amazing. He's always been one of those good players who occasionally flashes, and he's always worth owning, especially in those DT leagues. But this year was just something else. Hope most of many of our audience had him. I didn't have a lot of him at all personally, but there you go. So Mrs. Eric, who let us down at the DT spot? Who was an ADP failure?
Quinnen Williams. He was DT1, defensive lineman 16, and overall 24.5 in the ADP. So just end of the second round, early third. He finished as defensive tackle 18. This is the second straight year where he's disappointed us, but I'm not sure. And he's had good underlying numbers, but I'm not sure we should count 2022 as what should be his standard. The other 4 years he's played, he's been about the same as this year. A little bit lower this year than he was those other 3 of those 4. His tackle numbers went way down this year from 61 down to 37. His sacks stayed about the same as last year at 6, which again is about where it's been since 2020 when he came into the league. It's been 6-7 sacks almost every year except for 2022, that one big year when he had 12 sacks. And everybody continues to expect the 12 sack year out of him because of some of his underlying numbers, but I'm just not sure we shouldn't expect the 6-7 sack year with the occasional 10 to 12 sack year. I'm kind of starting to change my course on him because I have had him in a lot of leagues. He had 54 pressures, which was 2 more than 2022 when he had the 12 sacks. He did have 70 of them last year, but I just don't know what to think about him going forward. I'm kind of reversing course on him and thinking maybe we should expect the 6 sacks a year. And it's not that he had different snaps because he had 32 more snaps this year than he did back in 2022 when he had his huge year. So it's not that he's not on the field. I mean, he's like a typical defensive tackle, that 60% range or whatever. But he's an interesting case, but very disappointing this year.
Yeah, disappointing, no doubt. I'm inclined to think maybe somewhere between his banner year, is it 12 sacks, and what he's done the last 2 years might be what I would project him to do going forward. Because as I look down the list in terms of pressure totals amongst all the DTs, he is one of those who kind of falls into that bracket where you could maybe talk about him being a bit unlucky to have only 7 sacks despite registering sort of 54 pressures. There's a couple of others that qualify in that respect as well this year, the Chris Jones, Odigizua and so on. But yeah, I'd like to think, and I don't know if this is biased because I like the player, but I'd like to think maybe somewhere between those, with him trying to knock on the door of double-digit sacks each year, as opposed to getting somewhere near that 6 and 7 number, because that's just, as you say, too low, and certainly doesn't justify where he's being drafted. So,
yeah, too low for the talent that he flashes. It's just a very talented defensive tackle. So yeah, we'll see where he goes.
Yeah, and like you say, if the tackle volume was there, then maybe we could overlook some of this, but it's not. So yeah. It's a boom or bust player, it seems, right now. Talking of boom or bust, Ed Oliver is my choice in this spot, Eric, and he was the 10th DT taken, 80th overall, but he let us down, finished as the DT 38, and it's a shame, really. He was a bit unfortunate too, perhaps even more so than Quinnen Williams. Oliver only had 3 sacks, despite registering 42 pressures, which is really unfortunate. But even so, 42 pressures is a far cry from the 72 he had last year. And it wasn't just about missed time, because he did miss 3 games. He had some good weeks, but they were just very few and far between. 3 games. He only had 3 games with double-digit points. Sadly, 6 with 5 or less, and that just doesn't get it done in fantasy in any way whatsoever. So I think he could bounce back a little bit next year. He's going to see some positive sack regression there if he maintains that high pressure rate. But we're not here to talk about next year. We're here to review 2024. And there's just no getting away from the fact that, it was just massively disappointing in every sense. So Oliver is my choice. There it is.
Yeah, that's a great choice for that. I had him multiple places, and was it was a very disappointing year from him. And I really thought he was going to continue on his breakout from last year and continue soaring, and it just didn't happen.
Yeah, I know he ended the year slightly better. He had that one huge game, didn't he? We had almost double-digit pressures. Is that a sign that he kind of turned a corner there, and we can look forward to something better in 2025? Maybe, but again, like I say, I'm not here to talk about next year. This year was just a massive disappointment, and it's a real shame. So safety. is our next position. Who did well for us in this spot? Who was your safety ADP hit?
This guy was amazing to start the year. Kerby Joseph is who I chose. His ADP was safety 36, defensive back 53, and then overall 238, which isn't unusual. Defensive backs in these drafts typically go later. But he finished as safety 6. Had 82 tackles and 9 interceptions. And you remember that run at the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
He had 7 interceptions by week 11, just one after another. And so many of them to save a touchdown. He'd catch the interception in the end zone. And he trailed off towards the end of the year and then came back with a vengeance in championship week in week 17 with 2 interceptions and scored 30 points and big 3 scoring. So, I chose him. Just a great year to start the year. Carried it through week 11, trailed off a little bit, but great year for Kerby Joseph. That everybody thought Melifonwu and Branch would be the guys, and Melifonwu got hurt, and Joseph he balled out.
He definitely did, and that on a personal note, that big week he had in must have been week 17 was the fantasy championship in my home league, and my opponent had him, and he was one of the few players remaining to play. I was sweating that one in the worst way possible. But yeah, like you say, really, really good year from a fantasy perspective, and also I'd be remiss to mention he was superb as an NFL player as well, right? He was not just fortunate to be in the right spot at the right time. He really elevated his game to a level that I never thought he ever could. It'd be really interesting to see whether they can keep that going next year. But yeah, certainly his ADP is going to shoot through the roof. I doubt I'll be in a position to get him myself because I don't really tend to draft safeties that high, or certainly lower than other people do. But yeah, really fun to watch this year. It was him and Xavier McKinney, wasn't it, to start the year, neck and neck, just interceptions seemingly every week.
And in the same division, and just going interception for interception.
Yeah, that's it. So Nick Cross gets my shout. He was superb this year, considering he was the 76th taken safety and the 325th defender overall. I don't think really anybody saw this coming. I certainly didn't. And even when we started the year, he kind of started the year with those 2 or 3 massive games, double-digit games. I think in terms of tackle production, I think there were still some of us out there who weren't totally convinced, maybe because he played so deep in that first game versus the Texans. But he obviously didn't manage to keep sort of double-digit games going all season. That would be ridiculous. But he did end the year really well. Kind of kept it going most of the year. 139 total tackles. Only had 6 games where he finished with fewer than 10 points, and those are truly excellent numbers, especially for a DB. Helped him to finish as the safety 3, and I just think that's incredible value considering, as I say, he was the 76th safety taken overall. Doesn't get much better than that. Yeah,
he was great. Everybody kind of thought Blackman would be the guy this year, and they just kind of flopped roles where Cross was more a strong safety most of the year, and Blackman was deep more. And just an incredible year. Lots of tackles. So he had that good floor every week.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So who disappointed? Who was our miss at the safety spot?
I picked Jevon Holland. Everybody remembers the great interception on Thanksgiving Day a couple of years ago that he returned. And he's an exciting player. He makes big plays. He just didn't make the big plays this year. And honestly, he didn't make that many of them last year either. He was safety 15 in ADP, defensive back 18 in the overall 168. He finished as safety 60. Definitely want more than that out of your safety 15. 62 tackles, 1 sack, 1 forced fumble, 0 interceptions. He missed 2 games mid-season, had a low snap count in between those 2. But he had 300 more snaps in 2022, his big year, than he has any of his other 3 years. So he had 1 year where he had a bunch of snaps. He's missed some games, of course. he played deep over 50%, just over 50%, but over 50% of his snaps this year, which is actually pretty close to the same as last year. Basically, if he doesn't get his big plays, he's just not going to score you enough to draft him that high. There's only one Antonio Winfield. I can't even say his name. Only one Winfield.
Yeah.
And a guy that who's played deep quite a bit in his career, but continually makes plays all the time. And I think people thought Jevon Holland was going to be Winfield-like, and he just has fallen short so far.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sorry to correct you, but there's obviously two Winfields.
Oh, yes, you are correct. Yes, and they were both great.
Yes, they were. Yeah. But yeah, no, I'm right there with you with Holland. He has made a name for himself as this big play safety. He had that one big tackling year, but other than that, you know, and also he's never had a year recording as many big plays as the likes of, you know, the guys we just spoke about, Kerby Joseph, Xavier McKinney. He's never had those years. He's never had the kind of tackle output of Nick Cross. He's best avoided, I think. And this year, I think, if anything, has proven that we should lower expectations going forward with him. Very good player, but the production is never quite there, I don't think, or has been only once in 4 years, which is just not quite enough. So, talking of letdowns at the safety spot, Minkah Fitzpatrick. Now, he did finish as the safety 36, so he was usable in leagues where you start three safeties, 3 or 4 DBs. But considering he was the 11th safety taken, it's just not a great look, especially when he played pretty much every down all year. He had fewer than 10 points in 14 of his 17 games, which is obviously horrible. But Eric, this is another one, I think, where maybe we could have seen this coming. And if there's a lesson to learn, it's perhaps to follow, you know, prior production rather than that sort of name recognition. Minkah's only ever had one other season with more than 100 tackles. And for that reason, you know, I didn't draft him this year. Won't be drafting him next year, not unless his ADP catches up with the value he offers, which I think is very low right now. And even then, we're only talking about super late in those drafts. So, yeah, I've chosen Minkah. It was a disappointing year. I kind of expected it to be a disappointing year, but yeah, he was taken quite high.
Yeah, he, like you said, he just hasn't performed up to his name value. Everybody sees Minkah Fitzpatrick and they remember that one season, and they remember him as a draft pick too. He was highly touted coming into the NFL, and he's got the cool name, and people remember it. And he just has not performed. He'll have a boom game here and there, but mostly it's just disappointment.
Yeah, that's it. So where are we? We're on the safety misses. Let's talk about the cornerbacks then. These are really tough, I find, to predict before the season starts. So we do see some pretty big variances between ADP and where these guys finish each year. But who have you got as your cornerback hit?
Yeah, it's impossible to predict, it seems to me. Your top 12 changes year in, year out. I chose Marlon Humphrey, who I have always liked. I like the slot corners, even though they're not on the field 100% of the time, most of the time.
Yep.
They're just closer to the action. You know, the guys talk about being in the sweet spot, and Marlon Humphrey is one of those guys that's in the sweet spot quite a bit. Although this year, he did move to outside a little bit there for a few games where he was playing a little bit more outside, but his ADP was cornerback 37. He was defensive back 93 and overall 297, and he finished as cornerback number 3. 67 tackles, a half a sack, 2 forced fumbles, 6 interceptions. Like I said, he moved around a little between slot and out wide, but 10 weeks over 90% usage. So for a guy that plays a lot of slot, a lot of in the box, that's a cornerback and not a safety, that's really good usage. He needs to be on the field for Baltimore, and they know it. He played outside 32% and then sweet spot 66% of the time. He did play just a touch of free safety, but like I said, great snap count, great counting stats for cornerback, and just an overall great year for Marlon Humphrey.
Oh, for sure. One thing that I found interesting with him was that usage, that positional alignment, as you talked about there, the slot DB usage, and he kind of moved away from that in recent years. It's nice to see him get back to that. I don't know if anyone was able to predict that happening, and therefore, that kind of makes sense when we're talking about where he was being drafted versus how he performed. But yeah, he's certainly going to be increasing in value in those drafts next year, and it's going to be interesting to see whether he does continue in that slot. The way he played, you'd imagine it's quite likely, right?
Yeah. They think they know they need to keep him on the field. So.
Yeah. So my player is not of the caliber of Marlon Humphrey as an NFL player, not by a long stretch, but he was super productive this year. The 38th corner taken in our drafts, 287th defender overall, and yet he finished as the cornerback 2 and even outperformed the vast majority of safeties as well for those in those 3 position leagues. He finished as the DB4 overall. That's just crazy value. Now, it was a bit of a tale of two halves for him. He moved from the slot to the outside corner halfway through the year, and his production nosedived, especially after the Saints bye in, I think it was week 12 or week 13. But hopefully other IDP managers noticed in the way that I didn't for a week, and followed the advice of Johnny in the cornerback corner episode, and were quick to get out from under Taylor and find maybe another slot corner or highly productive outside corner. But yeah, like I say, reflecting on the year as a whole, he was so good, especially in that first half of the year. Finishes a DB4 overall, despite, as I say, tailing away after that sort of week 12 points. So yeah, crazy value.
Kind of speaks to how good of a year he had at the beginning of the year that when he went out wide, he tailed off and still was DB4. Alontae Tyalor just had an amazing year. And then that Saints, we were talking before we started recording, that Saints slot player has been really good for fantasy. Was when Alontae got moved outside, they brought Ugo Amadi in, and he was great and probably won some leagues at the end of the year. I know he helped me as I picked him up, traded for him, I guess, in that league. But it will be interesting to see if that slot cornerback role in New Orleans is still the same with the new coaching staff there. And but yeah, Alontae had a great year. Yeah.
Didn't have a lot of him myself. I stuck with my old faithfuls in the position, but yeah, it's really nice to see him do that for others. So who missed at the CB spot? Who didn't live up to their ADP?
I really didn't want to do this because I love him as a Hawkeye fan and a Philadelphia Eagle fan, and he went from the Hawkeyes to the Eagles. It's Cooper DeJean, and it's mostly people were drafting him as the cornerback number 3, and I actually wrote about it last summer in my Fades article that I thought they were drafting him too high. So cornerback 3, DB 15, overall 158. He finished as cornerback 46. Now, a lot of that is he got hurt in preseason, and that was July 23rd, and he came back August 13th, kind of part way, but he missed a good 3 or 4 weeks of the preseason, learning his role in the defense and knowing where he's supposed to be. So that kind of put him back to start the year, and he didn't really start full time as a starter for the Philadelphia until after their bye week in week 5. So
yeah,
there's 4 weeks there. He did get a snap here and there those first 4 weeks, but didn't really do much of anything. And I know people were drafting him that high, hoping he'd be kick returner, punt returner.
That's it.
He was never kick returner. I was hopeful of that too, because I thought his skill set and his vision is really good in the new kick return style. The Eagles just didn't put him back there. So that's unfortunate. He did end up doing some punt returning when Britton Covey got hurt.
Yeah.
And he was hurt most of the year, which was good for Cooper's numbers. And he's a restricted free agent going into next year. So hopefully they let him go away and Cooper can be the full-time punt returner, and that'll help him and us next year. But like I said, he started slow, but down the stretch between punt returning, making big plays, sticking Derrick Henry, he was getting pretty consistently right around 10 to 12 points a week after that bye week. And if you can get consistency from any cornerback, that's a nice piece to have on your team. So I'm excited for him for next year, but he did have a disappointing year this year.
And you hit the nail on the head, I think, when you talked about the return potential for return yardage. People are always looking for that edge, aren't they, at any position? Who was highly drafted early in that second round, and people saw that draft capital, maybe thought that he'd establish a role maybe earlier than he did. But yeah, like you say, didn't really offer us anything on the kick return front, and those punt returns, not valuable enough on their own to distinguish between, or to create a distinction, if you like, between him and the most valuable other DBs. And I wonder if because he played so well at times, once he did establish a role on the team, whether or not he might prove to be too valuable to risk on those punt returns going forward. So, but again, this is me looking forward to next year and getting carried away. But yeah, interesting point to watch and keep an eye on. I think it could affect his ADP next year. For me, though, few corners were as much of a miss as Sauce Gardner. He was the 9th corner taken, the 199th player overall, and yet he finishes the CB 63. And that's about as egregious as it gets, I think. I know he missed a couple of games, but even so, I must admit being a little bit confused as to why he was being taken so highly. He finished with 107 points in Big Three scoring, and that's only 10 points less than he managed the year before. So I thought maybe people were hoping that he could put up he had 182 points in his rookie year. Maybe people were hoping that he could do that again. I don't know. But again, it's maybe an opportunity to remind our audience, I'm sure the vast majority of which already know, I'm sure that they shouldn't be looking for those big names, those recognizable names, especially at the DB spot, I would say. Eric, I don't know if you'd agree with that. They just don't win you prizes. Look for production and specific roles and position alignment, I think.
You do not want a lockdown corner. NFL teams do, but your fantasy team does not. Unless maybe you're in those all 22 leagues. You do not want a lockdown corner. They just don't get the opportunities. If the ball's not thrown their way, how are they going to rack up tackles or pass defense or interceptions? You don't want those guys. So that's one, I guess, sad thing about fantasy football on the cornerback side is sometimes the best cornerbacks are just not going to score you the points. So he has the name recognition from being a lockdown corner. But he's also really high in the ADP on Sleeper. So sometimes I think his ADP is boosted in our leagues because he gets drafted unintentionally when somebody's clock runs out and he's at the top of the list and slides right in there. And so there's a little bit of that in his ADP too, I think.
Yes, I'd agree. And I was a bit remiss not to mention that he did miss a bit of time towards the end of the year. But it wasn't a huge amount of time, and it's not like he was on fire before then. So I think it's justified selecting him here. Not that I don't like him as a player. We're purely talking fantasy here. He's just not worth that roster spot, I don't think. Yep. So Eric, that's us done, my friend. We've rattled through that. This is the ADP hits and misses episode that we've got in the books now. It's pretty damn interesting, I think, that list we come up with. Any general takeaways that you saw there? Any trends, perhaps?
Not really any trends. Just we're going to be rolling these IDP only best balls out. I would imagine sometime in February again this year. They go all summer long. I would encourage all of our listeners to participate in those. It really helps you learn the IDP player pool deeper than you ever thought you would want to. And it's great because you see trends when you're going through those drafts throughout the summer as free agency hits and you start to see who's rising and who's falling, who people are taking, and the draft happens and you see some more of that shuffling, and then you get to training camp and you start to see, oh, this guy's name is rising, and so it really keeps you clued in so that then when you go to your other drafts, you really know how people are valuing other players or the players. And I think it's just a great experience.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I was in a fair few last year, not as many as you, I don't think, Eric. I kind of used the off season to maybe try and catch up on some of the sleep that I lose during the regular season and the NFL postseason. Being UK based, it's pretty hard. It can be pretty hard getting sort of 4 or 5 hours sleep on certain nights. But yeah, obviously you've got the draft queue as well, which you can utilize. So yeah, couldn't echo your thoughts anymore. Really, there it's a really great way to keep abreast of what's going on and to get a feel for how others value those players, because we sometimes operate in that little bubble, don't we, where we have our view on a player. We assume we're way higher or way lower than other people are, and it turns out that we're really not. So those drafts really give you a really clear view of what other people are thinking. So yeah, do join them if you have an opportunity to do so. But Eric, look, it's been a lot of fun chopping it up with you today, and I just want to take the time to thank you for coming on. It's been a blast. But before we do call it a day, do you have any specific off-season content or content plans that we can share with our audience?
I'm working on an article kind of similar to this. It's just kind of my the IDP madness that we did there at the end of the last offseason that has wrapped up now as the season's over. I'm looking at kind of the hits throughout the IDP Madness draft and some of the stars of IDP Madness.
That sounds like fun. I should look forward to seeing that. But again, it's been a lot of fun having you on. I hope you've had as much fun as I have, and I look forward to catching up with you again at some point. For
sure. Thanks for having me on, Jase. It's been a fun time and a pleasure.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. To our audience, thanks for checking us out. Please stay tuned for more of the same, as we'll be bringing you IDP content all the way through the off-season. As a reminder, if you don't already know, we'll be bringing you a new episode of the IDP After Show every other week during the off-season. And on the weeks when the After Show isn't available, Josh, Addy, and Bob will be delivering an episode of the main IDP shows. We've got something for you each week. So in the meantime, please don't forget to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube if you haven't already. We hope you enjoy the divisional round this weekend, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.
This was the IDP After Show.